Imagine standing on the deck of the largest ship in the world, under a cold, clear night sky. The sea is so calm that sailors call it a dead calm. There are no waves, no whitecaps, just a sheet of black glass stretching to the horizon in every direction. Above you, thousands of stars burn in the darkness. Behind you, inside the ship, music plays, glasses clink, people laugh. It feels safe. It feels civilized. It feels untouchable. And ahead of you, somewhere in that darkness, a silent mountain of ice drifts across your path. You don't know it yet, but in less than 3 hours, this ship that everyone calls Unsinkable will be gone, and more than 1,500 lives will be lost to the North Atlantic. This is the story of RMS Titanic, not as a movie romance, not as a simple legend, but as a real event filled with real people, real decisions, and real consequences. A story of technology and pride, of class and cold water. A story that still haunts the world more than a century later. To understand Titanic, we need to step back into the early 1900s, into the age of steam and steel, when nations were racing for power, prestige, and influence. On the oceans, that race played out through gigantic passenger liners. The Cunard Line had the fastest ships, sleek greyhounds like Lusitania and Mauritania. They were built for speed, for headlines, for records. Their rival, the White Star Line, decided to compete differently. Instead of the fastest, they would build the biggest and most luxurious. Out of that decision came 3 sister ships, Olympic, Titanic, and later Britannic. These were not just ships. They were floating cities, expressions of industrial confidence. Titanic would be the second of the 3, slightly improved over Olympic, and widely advertised as the last word in comfort and safety. She was built in Belfast, a massive skeleton of steel ribs and plates rising out of a dry dock, swarmed by thousands of workers. Inside, she was fitted out like a grand hotel, ornate wood paneling, sweeping staircases, electric lights in every corner, smoking rooms, reading rooms, restaurants, a swimming pool, Turkish baths, a squash court, even elevators. For the wealthy, Titanic was a palace that happened to move. In size, she was staggering for her time. About 269 meters long, with a gross tonnage over 46,000, and space for more than 3,000 people if fully loaded with passengers and crew. For many, she seemed like proof that human engineering had finally conquered the sea. But hidden inside these impressive numbers was a quieter, uglier truth. Titanic carried just 20 lifeboats. Even filled to capacity, they could hold only about half the people on board, around 1,178 seats for more than 2,200 souls. That sounds insane to us now, but at the time, it was legal. Maritime regulations were based on the size of the ship, not the number of passengers. Titanic actually carried more lifeboats than she was required to. On paper, everything was fine. On the ocean, it would not be. On April 10th, 1912, Titanic left Southampton on her maiden voyage to New York. At the dock, there was pride and spectacle. This was not just a ship leaving harbor, it was the departure of a symbol. People craned their necks to see the 4 huge funnels, the endless line of portholes, the decks stacked like a tiered wedding cake. On board, the human world was as stratified as the ship's decks. In first class were some of the richest and most influential people on Earth. Millionaire businessmen, socialites, politicians. Their cabins were larger than many city apartments. They dined on fine china under chandeliers, with multiple courses and attentive stewards. In second class were professionals and families of moderate means, teachers, clerks, merchants, people who could afford comfort but not extravagance. Their accommodations were still very respectable, better than many first-class cabins on older ships. In third class, sometimes called steerage, were the emigrants. They came from Ireland, Britain, Scandinavia, and beyond, carrying trunks and dreams. They hoped for new lives in America, new work, new beginnings. Their quarters were simpler, shared, and further down in the ship where the engine's vibration never quite disappeared. And then there was the crew. Officers in crisp uniforms, stewards, stokers feeding coal into the boilers, engineers, and the wireless operators sending and receiving messages from ships hundreds of miles away. At the top was Captain Edward J. Smith, a respected and experienced commander. This voyage, people said, would be his last before retirement. Titanic was a fitting final command, a crown on a long career. No one imagined that it would be his grave. After brief stops in Cherbourg, France, and Queenstown in Ireland to pick up more passengers and mail, Titanic headed west into the open Atlantic. The weather early in the crossing was calm. The engines throbbed steadily. The ship moved at about 21 to 22 knots, close to her full speed. Officially, there was no race, but there was always a quiet desire to arrive on schedule or even a little ahead of time. Big ships did not simply cross oceans. They performed. On board, life settled into routines. First-class passengers strolled the promenade, lounged in deck chairs, read novels in the library, played cards in the smoking room, or enjoyed music in the lounges. Men discussed business and politics. Women compared fashions and social connections. Children ran along corridors and played games under the eyes of nannies. Down below, third-class passengers made their own entertainment, singing, dancing, sharing stories of home and their hopes for the future. They explored the ship as much as they were allowed, sometimes wandering into spaces where stewards politely but firmly redirected them. Between these worlds, stewards and crew moved constantly, carrying messages, serving meals, changing linens, keeping the great machine of hospitality running. And all around them, invisible but constant, was the cold Atlantic. As Titanic steamed into the part of the North Atlantic known for ice, other ships began sending warnings. Wireless messages came in from vessels ahead of her on the route, reporting icebergs and field ice. Some of these warnings reached the bridge and were noted. Others were handled by the wireless operators, who were extremely busy relaying passenger telegrams to and from the shore. In 1912, the wireless was not seen primarily as a safety tool. It was part life-saving gadget, part luxury service for wealthy passengers who wanted to send messages mid-ocean. The wireless operators worked for a private company, not directly for the ship's officers, and they were overwhelmed with traffic. At least one critical ice message from a ship called the Californian was reportedly dismissed or delayed, partly because it came in while the operator was trying to catch up on a backlog of paid passenger messages. A tired human being made a choice about priorities. That choice would become part of Titanic's legend. Still, it's not true that no one knew about the ice. They did, but the night was clear. The sea was calm. There was a sense that they had time, that they could thread their way through the danger. Earlier that day, a lifeboat drill that had been scheduled was canceled. It seemed unnecessary on such a fine, uneventful voyage. That small decision meant that many crew members and passengers would face the real emergency that night with less practice and confidence than they might have had. As April 14th turned into night, the temperature dropped. The air grew sharper. The sea, already calm, took on an eerie, glassy quality. No waves slapping against the hull, just the hiss of water sliding by. Up in the crow's nest, two lookouts scanned the darkness. They had no binoculars. The key to the locker that held them had accidentally been taken ashore by an officer who did not sail. So they used their eyes alone, peering into a night with no moon, where the only light was starlight and the ship's own lamps. At 11:40 p.m., one of the lookouts saw something ahead. It wasn't a glowing iceberg shining like a ghost. It was a darker shape against the dark sky, a smudge that didn't belong, directly in front of the ship. The lookout rang the warning bell 3 times and lifted the telephone to the bridge. "Iceberg, right ahead!" On the bridge, First Officer William Murdoch reacted immediately. He ordered the engines reversed and the helm put hard over to turn the ship away. Titanic began to respond, but she was enormous and moving quickly. A ship that size does not dodge like a car. It swings slowly, dragging a mountain of metal behind it. The iceberg scraped along Titanic's starboard side, below the waterline. On deck, the impact didn't feel like an explosion. People described it as a shudder, a vibration, a long, low grinding noise. In cabins, some passengers were jolted, others barely noticed. A few lumps of ice landed on the forward deck. Some passengers even played with them, laughing. They didn't know that beneath the surface, the iceberg had punched and torn at the hull in a series of blows, popping rivets, bending steel, and opening seams across several compartments. There was no single giant hole. Instead, 6 of Titanic's 16 main watertight compartments were now exposed to the sea. Titanic had been designed to stay afloat with up to 4 compartments flooded. 6 was too many. Water began rushing in, cold and unstoppable. In the lower sections of the ship, firemen and crew felt the change immediately. They saw water pouring in where no water should be. They reported the flooding. The news moved up the chain of command. Captain Smith and Thomas Andrews, the ship's designer, went down to inspect the damage. Andrews understood what he was seeing with terrifying clarity. He reportedly told Smith that Titanic would sink, and sink soon within an hour and a half, 2 hours at most. There was no way around it. The watertight bulkheads did not go high enough. As the bow went down, water would spill over each one and flood the next. The ship was doomed. Up to this moment, Titanic had been marketed as practically unsinkable. No one had imagined the combination of speed, angle, and impact that would compromise so many compartments at once. Yet here they were. The question was no longer, can we save the ship? It was, how many people can we save before she goes? On the boat deck, crew members began uncovering and preparing the lifeboats. Many passengers had no idea what was happening. There was no general alarm, no sirens. Stewards went door to door in first class, politely telling people to put on warm clothes and life belts and come up on deck as a precaution. Some obeyed, some refused, annoyed at the disturbance. In third class, information was more limited and confusing. Passengers heard strange noises, felt the engines stop, and saw crew members moving with unusual urgency. Language barriers and physical gates designed to control movement between classes made everything worse. Some third-class passengers did not understand the danger until it was far too late. Titanic had 20 lifeboats, including 4 collapsible ones. Most people on board didn't realize that even if every boat was filled to capacity, there would still not be enough seats for everyone. But the officers knew. Thomas Andrews knew. Some of them surely felt horror at that fact as they looked down the rows of davits and boats. The order was given. Women and children first. It was not written in any law, but it was part of the unwritten code of the era. The way that order was interpreted varied from officer to officer. On one side of the ship, some boats were launched with only a handful of passengers because people hesitated to get in, or because no more women and children could be seen nearby, and the officer in charge refused to allow men to take the empty places. On the other side, officers were more flexible, allowing men to join once women and children had been seated. The result was tragic inefficiency. A boat designed for 65 left with 28 people. Another, built for over 40, sailed with barely half that number. Each underfilled boat meant more people left behind later. The calm sea, which had seemed like a blessing, now made the situation strangely deceptive. The ship was not violently rolling or plunging. It seemed solid, lit up, almost normal. Some passengers felt it was safer to stay on the big, bright ship than to climb into a small wooden boat and be lowered into the black ocean. Others believed that another ship would surely arrive soon, that this was all temporary. Far away, the wireless distress call was heard by the RMS Carpathia. Its captain, Arthur Rostron, ordered his ship to change course and head for Titanic at top speed, pushing through the night and through ice. But Carpathia was hours away. It could not possibly arrive before Titanic sank. Closer by, the Californian lay stopped in the ice, her wireless operator off duty. People on her deck saw strange lights and rockets in the distance, but those signals were misunderstood or dismissed. Whether through fatigue, assumption, or confusion, no one on the Californian grasped the scale of the disaster unfolding over the horizon until it was too late. On Titanic's decks, meanwhile, some people tried to maintain a kind of grim dignity. Well-dressed men stood smoking, talking quietly, waiting to see what would happen. Others were more openly panicked, begging for seats in boats, arguing with crew. The ship's band, led by Wallace Hartley, assembled and began to play. It's one of the most famous images from the disaster. Musicians standing on a sloping, freezing deck, playing waltzes, hymns, and popular tunes to steady the nerves of passengers as the ship sank under their feet. None of them survived. Below deck, engineers and firemen stayed at their posts as long as they could, keeping power and lights running so that the evacuation above could continue in some kind of order. It's easy to forget them, because they had no glamorous roles. But without them, darkness would have fallen much sooner, and chaos with it. As time passed, Titanic's bow sank deeper. The list and trim became more obvious. Water crept higher inside, flooding cabins, stairwells, corridors. More and more people were forced up onto the open decks. Lifeboats became harder to launch as the angle increased. The last collapsible boats were launched in confusion, one washing off the roof of the officers' quarters, others almost getting crushed by falling debris. In the final minutes, the stern rose higher out of the water. People clung to railings, clustered at the aft end, trying to keep above the rising sea. Some jumped and tried to swim away from the ship to avoid being sucked down. At around 2:20 a.m., on April 15th, 1912, Titanic's lights, which had been burning all night, flickered and went out. The great hull broke apart, and the pieces disappeared beneath the surface. Where there had been a majestic ship, there was now only open water, scattered debris, and hundreds of people fighting for life, in water so cold that survival could be measured in minutes. In the lifeboats scattered around the area, survivors watched and listened. They heard cries, screams, shouts for help, the sound of hundreds of voices in the dark. Slowly, those sounds faded as hypothermia took hold. Inside the boats, people argued about whether to row back and try to save more. Some feared that if they did, desperate swimmers would overwhelm the boat and capsize it. In most cases, fear won. Only a few boats returned to the area where the ship had gone down, and by the time they did, most of those in the water were already dead. It is one of the hardest parts of the story to think about. Not just the sinking, but the long, freezing minutes where lives might have been saved, but weren't. Hours later, just before dawn, a new shape appeared on the horizon. The lights of the Carpathia. She had raced through the dark, weaving through ice, driven by a captain who understood that he might be heading into danger himself. When Carpathia reached the given coordinates, there was no Titanic, only lifeboats and wreckage. For the next several hours, Carpathia's crew worked to haul survivors aboard. They brought them blankets, hot drinks, whatever comfort they could. On the decks, survivors shivered, cried, or stared silently at the empty sea where their ship had vanished. Some were numb, some were hysterical, some could not stop talking. Others said almost nothing. Once all the boats were accounted for, Carpathia turned away and headed for New York, carrying around 700 survivors and the invisible weight of 1,500 dead. News of the disaster traveled faster than the ship. Newspapers printed wild guesses and contradictory headlines. Titanic being towed to port. No lives lost. Ship badly damaged but afloat. Families waited at docks and telegraph offices, desperate for names, for any scrap of information. When the full truth emerged, it shocked the world. The largest, most luxurious ship ever built had sunk on its first voyage, in calm seas, on a clear night, after hitting something everyone knew existed: ice. Inquiries were launched on both sides of the Atlantic. Witnesses described ice warnings, lifeboats sent away half-empty, gates and corridors that kept third-class passengers from reaching the boat deck in time. Officers struggling to interpret women and children first. Wireless operators overwhelmed by messages. A nearby ship that saw some rockets but did not come. The investigations concluded that Titanic had been traveling too fast in a dangerous area, that lifeboat regulations were dangerously outdated, and that both companies and governments needed to rethink their assumptions about safety at sea. Out of the tragedy came real changes. Ships were required to carry enough lifeboats for everyone on board. Lifeboat drills became standard. Wireless rooms were staffed around the clock. An international ice patrol was created to monitor iceberg danger zones. Titanic's wreck itself remained hidden until 1985, when an expedition led by Robert Ballard finally located it more than 3,700 meters down on the Atlantic seabed. Images of the broken bow, the scattered debris, the ghostly emptiness of corridors and cabins added a new layer of reality to a story that had lived mostly in memory and imagination. In recent years, high-resolution 3D scans have captured the wreck in incredible detail, rivet by rivet, creating a digital model that will outlast the metal itself. Under the action of salt water, currents, and iron-eating bacteria, Titanic is slowly dissolving, collapsing in on itself. One day, the physical remains will be far less recognizable than they are now, but the story will not collapse with it. Titanic continues to fascinate us, because it feels like a perfect storm of elements: human pride, technical achievement, social inequality, quiet heroism, and avoidable tragedy. We see how people in power trusted technology too much, how regulations lagged behind reality, how class divisions literally shaped who lived and who died. We also see how individual choices mattered, how some people sacrificed their own chances of survival to help others, how some stayed at their posts, how some faced death with composure and kindness. It would be easy to turn Titanic into a neat moral fable about arrogance and punishment. But real history is messier than that. On that night in April 1912, there were cowards and there were heroes, but both were ordinary human beings. There were officers who made mistakes and officers who did everything they could. There were passengers in first class who gave up their seats, and passengers in third class who fought their way through confusion and barriers to get their families to safety. What makes Titanic a history unbroken story is not that the ship survived. It didn't. It's that inside this huge, mechanical disaster, the human spirit showed both its worst and its best. The laws of physics and the limits of design could not be negotiated with. The hull broke, the water came in, the ship went down. But in those 2 hours and 40 minutes, people chose how to respond. They chose whether to panic or to help, whether to lie or tell the truth, whether to save themselves or try, sometimes successfully, sometimes not, to save someone else. The ship was broken, the safety system was broken, but not everyone on board was. More than 100 years later, Titanic still warns us about overconfidence and complacency. It reminds us that technology is only as safe as the people and systems behind it, and it challenges us to think about what we would do if we found ourselves on a sinking ship, literal or metaphorical. Real events, unbreakable humans. And that is why the story of Titanic will not sink with the steel resting on the ocean floor. It survives every time we tell it, not as a legend about an unsinkable ship, but as a real, complicated, human story.